Oh, good. Jimmy's here. Hello, Hammer and Sickle, Ed Boy. Hello, Jimmy. Jimmy, you're going to be excited about what I have planned for today's show. I hope, or maybe you're not, but I hope you'll be excited. I figured maybe if I titled the stream Juche Necromancy, you would click on it. But Jimmy recently published a fantastic article for us on Midwestern Marks called Juche Necromancy, the fabricated executions in the DPRK. And this is essentially, I don't know if it's a thorough or full compilation of every instance of Juche necromancy in history, but it's pretty close. So for those who don't know, multiple times when the U.S. media has reported that Kim Jong-un had somebody executed, oftentimes in some kind of heinous way, like watching them or making their friends watch as they die by firing squad, or like throwing people into a vat of piranhas, is legitimately one of the stories that U.S. media reported that Jimmy discusses in this article. But this essentially goes through every time the U.S. media has usually taken a South Korean tabloid that reports on some heinous execution committed by Kim Jong-un. So like People Magazine or TMZ, basically there are similar outlets in South Korea that report these just clickbait stories that are usually, if you trace them all the way back to their source, there is no source, or the source is extremely vague. And then in a lot of instances, someone who they reported dead has showed up alive weeks, months, or a few years later. So Jimmy detailed a whole bunch of those stories here. I've put this article that he wrote in the description for today's stream. So you can click it below if you want to check it out and see what it's all about. Read it for yourself. But I just wanted to go over some of the funnier ones that he listed here and compare them to some of the stuff that I'd talked about. Obviously, I did a video recently, or a big long stream, about the North Korean defector industry, how these celebrity defectors like Yeonmi Park are groomed by South Korean intelligence, by the CIA and US NGOs, and then they basically just become celebrities while making up or parroting the most heinous stories about North Korea, like these tabloid stories or whatever else. So Yeonmi Park has been one of the most famous ones. She was literally on Andrew Schul's podcast recently, which makes this stream that I did about it even more timely, I guess. But one of the things that I covered in my stream was a North Korean artist who was apparently shot like 60 to 90 times in front of the rest of the orchestra that they were a part of. And there's almost an identical story here in Jimmy's article about Hyun Sung-woo. I don't know if it is the exact same story that I covered, but basically all that I said in my video was that the story had no real sources, that there was essentially no real concrete evidence that this had happened at all. And then Jimmy reported that actually 8 to 9 months later, the person who was supposedly executed by firing squad in front of the orchestra resurfaced. So this is what we call Juche necromancy, when Kim Jong-un executes people and then brings them back to life. Of course, this is only possible because of the U.S. media and their lack of journalistic integrity and their willingness to publish anything, even if it's just some South Korean tabloid story. Which one of the best breakdowns of this that I've seen, which I think is an underrated breakdown of it, although I'm very biased, is the video from Professor Derek Ford that we did here. So this was an interview. This is up on Spotify as well, as part of the Midwestern Marks podcast, I believe. But you can watch this on YouTube. And it's our interview with Professor Derek Ford of the Liberation School, who spent a lot of time in both North and South Korea, touring the country, talking to people, learning about their history, studying their history. So he came on our show and talked to us about everything to do with the DPRK, starting with the Korean War, or not even starting with the Korean War, starting with their anti-colonial struggle, the older history of the peninsula, how long Korea was unified before it was divided, and before the U.S. killed 20% of the Korean population with bombs. So lots of great history in here. He also talks about the current economic sanctions on Korea, which are the most stringent of any sanctions in the world, besides the ones that the U.S. keeps on Cuba. But this is an especially interesting point where he talks about the propaganda war, the defector industry, the celebrity defectors, and the way that U.S. media circulates unsourced stories from South Korean tabloids.
Those are, some of the tactics. I mean, the propaganda war, the economic sanctions, the political sanctions, and the constant demonization and propaganda, the defector industry, which, by the way, no scholar has taken any defector testimony seriously since 2000, just because it's so unreliable. That Camp 14 book, that was published and made famous, the UN star, witness, fabricated his story, later admitted he fabricated it. So nobody takes that seriously except for the US media, pretty much, and they publish anything, right? I mean, I remember a couple of years ago, they published an article saying that everybody in North Korea had to get the same haircut as with Kim Jong-un, right? You know where they got that story from? A South Korean like a tabloid, like a National Enquirer. They picked it up on the newswire, and they didn't know who it was from, and they just ran with it, and they retracted it, but obviously the retractions in the back of the newspaper, so nobody pays attention to that. But just the fact that people would believe that shit. And I remember when I told that story once when I was in the South to people, and they were stunned. They were like, "Oh my God, people believe that?" And I mean, these are progressive people, of course, but still they were like, that's absurd, So think about the ways that we've been conditioned that the majority of the population would believe that something like that would happen. Like the government doesn't have anything better to worry about than how people wear their hair. You know what I mean? They're under constant threat. So we should also include the actual military threats and the actual military interventions in the South China Sea.
So yeah, he goes on to talk about how Korea is encircled by the U.S. and how they're under those stringent economic sanctions I mentioned. It's like, you really think their government is, spending all of their time, energy, and resources enforcing that everybody wear the same haircut as Kim Jong-un? Or actually, there was one story that said that everyone had to get the same haircut. And then there was another story that said you would actually be executed if you had the same haircut. So, you can't win in North Korea. You get executed no matter what haircut you have. You really think this is where the government is putting their resources and energy enforcing things like this? Or building giant piranha pits for Kim Jong-un to throw people he doesn't like into them? No, they're busy trying to survive, trying to run a country, trying to make sure that they do have the support of their people, because people will overthrow a government if it's not, if it's not serving them for a long enough period of time. So, the absurdity of some of these stories. That's one of my favorite lines in that entire podcast with Derek Ford is when he's like, South Korean people are like, Americans believe this? Are you kidding me? Just think about the logic of it. It's like that Yeonmi Park story I covered in the live stream about her, where she said that North Korean people or people in North Korean hospitals eat rats. The hospitals are just filled with rats, and that's all that people eat. But then when people die in the hospitals, they just get stacked in a room, and then the rats eat them. And then the other patients eat the rats, and it's just an endless cycle of rat and human eating. This isn't physically possible. This is not possible. And if someone just came up and told you this story on the street, you wouldn't believe it, right? But then if you look at the sourcing for a lot of these stories that U.S. media reports as fact, it's literally a defector said this. Somebody said this on Here I Am Coming to See You, or whatever it's called, this TV show in South Korea that features defectors and pressures them to tell the most insane stories. So some of the outlets who published this story that Jimmy talked about here, about Hyun Sung-wol, the orchestra conductor and musician who was apparently murdered by firing squad. You have Business Insider, fairly mainstream outlet, fairly quote unquote respected outlet, not like New York Times or anything that people would take totally serious, or that most people take totally serious, but still. fairly large corporate media outlet. You also have Slate.com, again, an outlet, not like one of the most respected outlets in the country, but one with a lot of money, one with a nice production value, and one that demands respect or has this air of authority, that a lot of media outlets with a lot of money and a high production value kind of inherently have with people. And, they just report this stuff over and over and over and over again until most Americans have this general idea about the DPRK that's just ridiculous. It's just absurd and based not in reality, but in this, comic book level understanding of, how this country works and how their politics and economy work, what their history is like, what their political ideology is. It's completely schizophrenic, someone says. I don't know if that's the word, but it's completely divorced from reality. This is really funny too. The first thing that this Smithsonian Magazine article says, which Smithsonian is, usually when you hear Smithsonian, you probably think of the Smithsonian Museum, but you think of educational, right? Like they wouldn't just be pulling stuff out of their ass and reporting it, but North Korea reportedly executed pop singers and dancers. This is the pop singers and dancers who showed up alive a few months later. And they say, so far, only one South Korean outlet has reported on the latest possible atrocity. And unfortunately, it will probably remain that way. Oh, yes, the horrible authoritarian censorship of the communist DPRK, of the socialist workers' government of the DPRK and the Workers' Party. They don't want to publish fake stories about their own country. They don't want to publish a fake story claiming that somebody was executed who's actually alive. Though the censorship of socialism, how terrible. Like, come on. This is absurd. So that just gives you an example. And it's, like I said, maybe these aren't the most respected or even the most mainstream outlets all the time. But a lot of times you do get stories like the haircut story reported by BBC and a lot of more respected journalistic outlets that you would think wouldn't be making ridiculous mistakes and publishing ridiculous stories and having no journalistic integrity. But even when it's not those outlets, even when it's just like People Magazine and you're walking through the grocery store every day and you see People Magazine has some weird story about Kim Jong-un feeding people to piranhas or whatever, it creates a general sense amongst Americans, like I said, that the DPRK is just crazy. Kim Jong-un is just running everything. Another one of the stories that our buddy Jimmy covered here is Kim Kyong-hui. I don't know how this is pronounced, but someone who was reported in a 2015 CNN article to have been executed by Kim Jong-un. Is this the one that he said was his aunt? I'm not sure, but CNN is a very, very mainstream outlet that was reporting this pure unsourced nonsense. Kim Kyong-hui. Oh, this is the one. Okay, I had the right one. So this is apparently in 2014, Kim Jong-un murdered or executed his own aunt, or aunt, however you say it. I don't know what part of the country you're in, or if you're not even in the country. Later, Kim Jong-un's aunt, who he apparently executed, showed up on a TV show completely fine. What do you know? Juche necromancy strikes again. Kim Jong-un takes life away just to give it back. Either that or U.S. corporate media completely made this up. So, again, this stemmed from a South Korean tabloid whose sources for the article was a defector testimony, I believe, or one of the other ones was sources from China. That was all it said. It was just sources from China, as if that's concrete evidence. But reported by CNN World. Very, very serious reporting here from Paula Hancock, the CNN journalist, showing a lot of journalistic integrity by publishing a story that there was no source for, and claiming that a woman was executed before she showed up 8 to 9 months later on TV. So that's the power of communism there. You can literally bring people back to life who U.S. corporate media claims have died. And what's so funny, like, this story isn't entirely related to the execution of Kim Jong-un's aunt, Kim Kyong-hui, but it just shows how disconnected from reality and how not based in concrete evidence and facts the U.S. reporting is on the DPRK. Because this article says, is Kim Jong-un's aunt Kim Kyung-hui calling the shots in North Korea? Is she actually the one in charge deciding everything that happens, and Kim Jong-un is just a puppet? But then, another outlet reports 2 years later or whatever that she's actually executed by Kim Jong-un. So she's not calling the shots, and none of this is sourced at all. And it's like, for those of us who want to do serious political analysis and economic analysis of what's going on in the DPRK, and what they're doing to take care of try and take care of their people and try and construct socialism and combat US imperialism and, the history of their country and what really happened with the Korean War. For those of us who are trying to have a real serious conversation about the DPRK, this stuff just seems so absurd, and it poisons the well so much. It makes it impossible to have a serious discussion because you have to break through walls of propaganda whenever you talk to people about Korea. They literally see it as a comic book because of all these conflicting, baseless stories from US media that all have the same general idea: North Korea bad, the DPRK bad. So the theme of this video is one, that Juche necromancy is real and it brings people back to life, but two, that the US corporate media narrative and even US entertainment media's narratives gives Americans this general sense of North Korea being evil and being some crazy country where they're all just, under the iron rule of one man or a handful of people. When in reality, our country is much closer to that, with the dominance of finance capital and bankers and multinationals and the rest of them. But it makes it impossible to have serious debates or serious discussions about the DPRK and diplomacy, which is, how a lot, Americans look at geopolitics in general, or how propaganda teaches us to look at geopolitics in general. Other countries aren't, just entities or nations trying to take care of their people with their own interests and their own goals and their own things that they want. Other countries are comic book villains who kill their own people for fun and, throw their people's puppies in incinerators just because they want to. And that's other governments. And the people are just too stupid. They don't have as much freedom as America, so they just take it. It's ridiculous. And, it's disgusting too, the lack of journalistic integrity. You have these like mainstream media journalists, and the gray zone guys are always, laughing at this and mocking these people. But you have like these mainstream journalists who climb the career ladder of political journalism. And it's like the higher up you go, the more unserious you get, or the more you want to make it in journalism, the more bullshit you have to publish and circulate. It works the opposite is how it should. And these folks pretend to be serious journalists when in reality they're just pure propagandists publishing what they must know is nonsense. If they have any kind of journalistic integrity, they have to know that, these stories don't have any sources. But here's BBC reporting. CNN was wrong about that, actually, because the first Kim Jong-un's aunt, who he apparently killed, reappeared 6 years later. Juche necromancy, it never fails. Unbelievable. That's the power of Marxism. Marxism combined with Korean nationalism. And actually, if you Google it, Kim Jong-un has had pretty much all of his uncles and aunts executed. Not only did he have that aunt executed who showed up 6 months later, but her husband, and another uncle of his. No sources for any of these, of course. But so the story that Jimmy ends with, and you've heard me mention this a few times in this segment, the story that he ends his article with, that again is sourced in the description here, is this claim that Kim Jong-un went full James Bond villain and dumped one of his enemies in a tank full of piranhas as a form of execution. So again, the DPRK, who's under these stringent economic sanctions and who had to really go through a hard time and find a way to become self-sustainable and find a way to produce enough food and necessary goods for their people to survive after the collapse of the Soviet Union, because it left them with really only China as a trading partner, and the U.S. blocking off trade with the rest of the world using their military and sanctions and control of the global financial system. So even, in the process of saving their resources and rationing their resources to try and take care of their people in the face of horrible imperialist economic warfare, the DPRK also took the time to build a piranha tank so Kim Jong-un can throw people he doesn't like into it, and he can watch them be eaten by piranhas, which is, it's got to be more satisfying for him. So just think about how poorly all of these articles are sourced, and then think, how likely is it that Kim Jong-un and the Korean government went to the effort of building a piranha tank to throw people in. And there's an insane amount of Western news outlets who publish this story as if it's true. Like, it's insane. It's mostly from the UK, which I guess, maybe because it sounds like James Bond. So people in the UK will be interested in a story that makes Kim Jong-un sound like a James Bond villain. Like, you have the Daily Mail UK. You have the Irish Post, which obviously isn't the UK, but same area. You have the Mirror UK. You have the Metro UK. All of these outlets reporting an absurd story that the leader of another country is so crazy that he throws people in vats of piranhas to have them eaten like a literal James Bond villain. And there's no source, there's no concrete evidence. It's just pulled out of their butts. This is journalism. This is journalism in a developed capitalist country, and it's not just the US. It's the UK as well, and in other European countries. But of course, there was a US outlet who reported this. I don't even know what
a way to
it is. Tomo News. Anyone know what Tomo News is? They did a whole video about this.
go. It appears, what a way to go. It
What a way
appears
to
that
go
North
is
Korea's
right.
Kim Jong-un has decided to go full-out Bond villain by having one of his generals offed by tossing him into a piranha-filled fish tank. According to the Daily Star, FATS sent down the order after the general was accused of plotting a coup. The Daily Star reported that the giant fish tank was built inside Ryongsong residence, one of Kim's presidential palaces, after the dictator ordered his underlings to come up with some new ways of execution.
And the other thing is, the U.S. has been keeping the DPRK under sanctions. The U.S. killed 70% of their population. The U.S. did everything they could to destroy North Korea while boosting South Korea after they divided the country and occupied the South and installed a fascist dictator. Right? So we know that the U.S. wants to overthrow the North Korean government. We know they want to overthrow the DPRK and have access to their resources and labor and markets. And we know that the U.S. has a history of doing coups and real regime change efforts. So there are efforts, there are things that need to be done in the DPRK to defend from coups, to protect from coups, to stop spying, to stop U.S. infiltration and the destruction of their country or the overthrowing of their people's sovereignty. So they portray Kim Jong-un as this, leader of the Game of Thrones, sitting upon the throne. And this is how they portray anybody who doesn't give access to their country's resources and labor to the U.S. or Western multinationals. Any country who doesn't allow themselves to be dominated or crushed under the boot of Western multinationals is this evil dictator winning the Game of Thrones. Same thing they do with Stalin. Same thing they do with Fidel. And really, it goes back to the more successful a leader in a country are in building socialism and protecting from imperialism, the more that the propagandists and the Western finance capitalists are going to make them out to be evil, crazy comic book villains.
Looks like the general's arms and torso were introduced to some knives before the meet and greet with the piranhas. Well, more like eat and greet. The Daily Star reported that sources said it was unclear if the general succumbed because of the fish, his wounds, or drowning. Kim's
What's this animation? What's ironic and terrible is because of the U.S. sanctions, they probably don't have, like fried chicken and giant cheese wheels that Kim Jong-un can just eat all the time. Although they, since that time in the 90s after the Soviet Union's collapse, when North Korea was under dire economic circumstances, they've really improved and become more self-sufficient, which is due to their own efforts for sure, due to socialist economic planning and collective farming and the industrialization of agriculture and socialist production in North Korea and the DPRK, but also due to the growth of China. The socialist economic planning in China and their efforts to develop and build up their allies around the world, which of course includes the DPRK. And if we're being honest, if we're being realistic, the DPRK wouldn't have been able to survive without China. It was necessary for their survival with the U.S. sanctions and whatnot. So good stuff though. So thank you to Jimmy for that article. As I said multiple times, it is linked in the description below or above if you're watching on Facebook. Check that out. Check out our other video about Yeonmi Park, and definitely check out our video with Derek Ford, the podcast with Professor Derek Ford. That is a really good one. If you want another source on the North Korean defector industry, check out Loyal Citizens of Pyongyang. This has sort of become like the quintessential source for learning about the defector industry and the propaganda, which of course is why it's deemed inappropriate by YouTube. And you got to say you're 18 or whatever and to watch it. But this basically shows how the defector industry works, shows how the South Korean intelligence agency, which is basically a cutout of the CIA, that was, armed and, supported and really controlled by the CIA for years. How they basically broker people, offer people in North Korea money to come to South Korea and say that it's much freer. You'll have all this money, all this freedom. It'll be great, even though we know the economic conditions in South Korea for working people are terrible, which is why we're seeing movies like Squid Game and Parasite come out of South Korea now. But anyways, these brokers will offer people in North Korea money, say, come here. And then, there are these tabloid stories, or there are these tabloids that will pay you for crazy stories. And there's also a TV show called, I can't remember what it's called, like Now on My Way, Coming to Meet You or something like that. But it's a TV show that will give defectors money or have defectors come on and tell their stories. So after these people leave the DPRK, a place where, the government will give you a job where your basic needs will always be taken care of, essentially, as long as you work, although they don't have the same level of consumerism and wealth outside, or that exists outside of North Korea. So after these people are tricked by the South Korean intelligence agency to leave that kind of socialist collective economy, they end up in the ruthless trickle-down world of neoliberal capitalism. And they're incentivized to tell as crazy stories as they can so that they can make money. Selling these stories to tabloids or going on this TV show. It's like Here I Am Coming to Meet You or something. We should look it up. Now on My Way to Meet You. That's what it's called. So a lot of these defectors, after they get brokered and tricked into leaving, they're incentivized to just badmouth the DPRK as much as they can to try and get picked up by Western NGOs or libertarian think tanks like the ones who fund Yeonmi Park, this TV show, because it's a way to make income. And now if you look at Yeonmi Park, the most successful defector, like her whole income is tied to just talking crap about the DPRK, justifying U.S. regime change efforts against the DPRK. I just searched Andrew Schultz. I meant to search Andrew Schultz, Yeonmi Park, but look how famous she is now, too. She's completely rich, living an elaborate, wealthy lifestyle in the U.S., just going around doing podcasts and speaking engagements, and it's all made up. But there are so many who don't end up like Yeonmi Park and who don't have the success of her and who aren't boosted by the defector industry and these NGOs and the South Korean intelligence agency, like these people who are interviewed in Loyal Citizens of Pyongyang, who were tricked by brokers into leaving their home country, into leaving the DPRK, and regret it and realize, that capitalism is ruthless and it doesn't take care of them, like the economy and the government, the Workers' Party and the DPRK does. And, you know, the imperialist capitalists are liars who are trying to destroy the DPRK and make them look like comic book villains. So these are two of the defectors. And then this is a lawyer who goes after the South Korean intelligence agency and who goes after people who trick people into leaving the DPRK, goes after these brokers. But, you know, it's tough because for years in South Korea, it was illegal to say good things about the DPRK or to criticize the government. Like the U.S. quite literally installed a fascist dictatorship because nobody wanted to support Syngman Rhee, this U.S.-backed fascist dictator. So the DPRK, the North Koreans, were just wiping or going through the peninsula, liberating more and more places. And when they were about to liberate the whole place, that's when the U.S. intervened and, you know, bombed every building in North Korea over 2 stories tall into dust and killed 20% of their population so that they could really occupy the South and place this fascist dictator in power who then banned people from criticizing him or talking good about the DPRK. So yeah, wild the perception versus the reality. Have you reacted to any infographic show nonsense? Yeah, like all of their, every time I react to them, it goes viral by the standards of our YouTube, which are not the same as our TikTok, where things just tend to blow up all the time. Like we've reacted to Stalin worse than Bill Gates, Mao, evil butcher of China, infographics on Venezuela. How cruel is North Korean leader Kim Jong-un?
At 34 years old, Kim Jong-un is one of the youngest world leaders alive today, and he's certainly by far the most infamous. But what makes him so terrifying? Today, we'll take a look at some of the cruelest things he's done. In this episode of the Infographics Show, how brutal is Kim Jong-un? In 2011, the world was formally introduced to Kim Jong-un, the third dynastic ruler of North Korea since 1950. Kim's cruelty started almost as soon as he assumed power. Faced with the specter of a possible coup from within the ranks of the nation's top political and military elite, Kim Jong-un immediately began a political purge that is rumored to have killed dozens of senior officials. In his bid to consolidate power and prevent any challenge to his authority, he even went so far as to have his own uncle executed, and years later, paranoia concerning his half-brother led him to dispatch assassins to Kuala Lumpur in 2017.
I told you, if you Google it, according to Western corporate media, Kim Jong-un has killed all of his aunts and uncles, every single one of them. He had them all executed. A lot of them showed up, you know, a few months later or a few years later, which is just Juche necromancy in action. Kim Jong-un killing people just to raise them back from the dead. But yeah, that proves it. He's a dictator, killed all his aunts and uncles.
But political purges are simply par for the course concerning Kim's cruelty. His real crimes against humanity are committed on a daily basis against his own citizens. Wait until you hear about the laws they must follow and the penalties they incur for breaking them. The hallmark of North Korean cruelty is known as the 3 generations rule, established in 1972 by Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-un's grandfather. The 3 generations rule mandates that any serious crime warrants punishing not just the offender, but 3 generations of his or her family as well. This is, according to Kim Il-sung, the only way to exterminate the seed of evil completely. What this means is that in North Korea, if your father committed a grave crime against the state, you and your children would also be sent to a prison camp alongside him for the rest of your life.
I don't know what, and obviously not everybody who commits a crime the next 3 generations are just thrown in prison. How would that even work? Right? What are these people having babies in prison and then their babies are kept in prison? Or, you know, is it people who have children and then they commit a crime and their children, when they turn 18, they're thrown into prison? How would this even be organized? It doesn't make any sense. The unicorn made me think of this. A lot of these stories, you know, like there probably is some rule in the DPRK. I'm not familiar with what this stems from, but there probably is some rule about how, like, if a father commits a crime, you know, there's some things that have to be done to make sure his kids are taken care of, to make sure that they're supported economically and that they have education and things that won't let them, you know, go down the same path. Because a lot of these propaganda stories are taken from things that are real. So you see here, he's saying, someone once told me I'm delusional. I almost feel like I am a unicorn. Then I had them executed. So this is making fun of a story that U.S. media reported that said Kim Jong-un had discovered a unicorn. Right? They claimed that Kim Jong-un was saying he discovered a unicorn. It was real, and the U.S. media was using this to mock Kim Jong-un and mock the DPRK. But as Susie Kim, Rutgers professor, points out in this excellent presentation called Dispelling Myths About North Korea, that's actually not what happened at all. There was an ancient cave found in South Korea across the demilitarized line that had like a unicorn creature carved into it, which shows that it shows that there was some ancient civilization connected to the DPRK and the North Korean people that was in this region, that lived in this region and had a civilization in this region. And the fact that they carved a unicorn into this cave showed that they had been there and they had lived there. That was what was reported by the DPRK officials. The U.S. media took that and said that Kim Jong-un, said that he discovered a unicorn. So they take something real, a real, rational, normal story, and they turn it into something insane. If somebody gets convicted of a crime, if they steal a Snickers bar, their kids and their grandkids will be in a labor camp for life.
A prison camp alongside
Don't ask us for evidence or proof.
him for the rest of your life. The three generations rule is supposed to be only for great offenses, but testimony from North Korean defectors and escapees shows that it has been enacted for offenses from political dissent to
Testimonies from North Korean defectors and escapees. The testimonies that haven't been taken seriously by scholars for years and years and years because there's a defector industry in South Korea created by the South Korean ruling capitalist class, the CIA, and the South Korean intelligence agencies. Yes, we can definitely trust them.
failing to remove dust from a portrait of any of the Kim ruling family members. Conditions inside the labor camps are purposefully cruel as well, with prisoners being fed barely enough to stay alive and forced to try to catch rats and insects to eat. Survivors have described 12-hour hard labor workdays, 7 days a week, with people.
Survivors have described this. That's every single source, right? When we criticize the defector industry, one of the things that people are bound to say is, well, not all the stories about North Korea are fake, right? Some of them got to be true. And if any of these crazy stories are true, the place is, a dictatorship. It's horrible. And not to say the DPRK is perfect, of course, not to say there aren't real criticisms that can be made. But a lot of these stories are so absurd and so detached from reality. And it's because they all stem from this defector industry where, like I said, people are brokered out of North Korea. They're tricked by South Korean intelligence into leaving. And then, the main way for them to make money is to come up with the craziest stories they can about the DPRK that'll get picked up by tabloids or TV shows or the West, corporate media in the West. And those are the ones who really make it, the celebrity defectors like Yeonmi Park, who just tour America and tell these stories about the DPRK. But every source in these infographics video is defectors and survivors. When these defector testimonies haven't been taken seriously in years and years and years. And one of the funniest things I heard was a liberal told me that, you have to believe survivors. So therefore you have to believe these sources that haven't been taken seriously by academics forever. In reference to sexual assault survivors, and believing their testimonies. They said that we also have to believe the testimonies of Yeonmi Park and the North Korean defectors. One of the most liberal arguments I think I ever done heard.
Becoming physically stunted and deformed from the unceasing work. Beatings, torture, and rape are all commonplace in these camps, and there exists no possibility of parole. North Korea's constitution technically guarantees freedom of the press, but the state does not allow any foreign or non-state sponsored media to operate.
Their constitution involves freedom of the press. I'm surprised they even said that, right? Which is crazy. Not every socialist country has had freedom of the press as a founding principle. There has been open debate and criticism, but, they always leave a little room for censorship of fascist ideology or whatever. But North Korea has freedom of the press, and they're like forced to admit that before they say that, no, they don't follow it. They don't follow it like us in the U.S., where social media oligarchs and people like Rupert Murdoch dominate the news media.
It is therefore technically illegal to operate any independent press, and this is a law that Kim's North Korea enforces strictly. All foreign media is completely banned from the nation, making it illegal to watch foreign TV shows or movies, listen to foreign radio or music, or even read foreign books. While North Korea does have a state-run version of...
What do you mean you can't have independent media? There are literally U.S. corporations and U.S. government officials freaking out because there are North Korean vloggers who are getting popular. There are people in North Korea producing vlogs and just showing what their everyday life is like. And the U.S. propagandists are like, no. You're going to ruin our illusion. You're going to ruin our myth about North Korea. So it's the opposite. It's the capitalist ruling class scrambling to ban and suppress anyone like Midwestern Marks, who recently had our 8th TikTok account banned, who will tell you the truth about North Korea, or even, you know, real North Korean citizens producing their own media. So yeah, and there's going to be more, there's going to be more and more of that stuff with time. There's, you know, a lot of vloggers in China who just show what everyday life is like. They, you know, show what the train station's like. They show what the city is like, and they show that there aren't any homeless people, and that everything's clean and well kept up and well taken care of. And it shows what socialism has been able to build and bring the people in China. So there's going to be more and more and more of that, where Americans are just going to see vlogs and everyday life is better in socialist countries than it is in capitalist countries for the working masses. And the capitalists are going to scramble to ban it, of course. So, yeah.